So some things that worked for us last week. We looked at Zach Ertz and the fact that he was getting a lot of opportunity. It looked at least streamable, especially based on his Dynasty value and ADP. We also talked about how Deebo Samuel was pretty much splitting the work and actually out-routing Brandon Ayuk. And while the narrative was that Deebo Samuel, or rather Brock Purdy, liked Brandon Ayuk more than Deebo Samuel, my one takeaway from last week looking at San Francisco is that he seems to like Deebo Samuel just as much as Brandon Ayuk, and it was really an overbalanced number of opportunities in the red zone that worked out for Brandon Ayuk last week. And because red zone opportunities are a little more sketchy in terms of consistency on a week-to-week basis or even a season-long basis, we expected that to change in week 2. Now, Brandon Ayuk also might have some lingering injury issues which affected that, but so far betting on Deebo Samuels, as long as he doesn't get injured, has worked out pretty consistently for us in Dynasty, and again, in week 2, that ends up looking pretty good. Some things that didn't work out for me, at least, was that James Cook looked like a top 24 ceiling running back after the overall week 1 numbers, and in week 2 he finished in the top 12, so that looks like an outright miss. I also said that Puka Nakua's usage looked very inconsistent. Right now, especially based on his ADOT, which is like 30% of what Tyreek Hill gets, he has to maintain Tyreek Hill level efficiency in yards per route run on 30% of the ADOT in order to maintain this overall production. He's earning routes fairly effectively, which means that we probably should and have, in fact, risen his value pretty strongly in Dynasty to at least a late 24 first. But he can't maintain this efficiency long haul. For example, Tyreek Hill is one of the few players over the last 4 seasons who's maintained a yards per route run over 3, and that's with an ADOT that's 3 times further down the field, making it a little easier to maintain a 3 yards per route run. Now, while Puka Nacua won't drop to nothing, I'm not predicting doom for Puka Nacua, don't hate me in the comments too much, I don't think he's going to maintain that efficiency over a season long, because most players don't. In fact, we only get 1, maybe 2 players to maintain that level of efficiency for an entire season, and most of them have had at least twice the ADOT of what Puka Nacua has. Now, while his fantasy production can still be good, and it might settle down into something long-term that's pretty nice, especially when Cooper Kupp comes back to the field and helps the overall offense in general, I think so far we're a little too hyped because we've seen a lot. In fact, we've seen more from a rookie from Puka Nacua than we have from any rookie over the first 2 weeks since 2018, despite Jamar Chase and Jalen Waddle seasons being 2 of the best rookie seasons ever, and he's outproducing them through the first 2 weeks. But something that's notable that I mentioned on Twitter is that if you look at the most productive rookies through the first 2 weeks, you see a lot of good players, and Rondale Moore, who currently looks like a failure of mine personally in fantasy, but you don't see all the best players. So those first 2 weeks are really a small sample problem. It's positive. We should definitely move him up in Dynasty, but I'm still a little suspect of his overall opportunity and whether he can maintain this level of production for a season, let alone career long, and so I'm still a little hesitant, and there definitely hasn't been a buy window. But still, through the second week, he definitely pwned my week 1 takeaway from his overall volume, but I do expect that to come back in line. Now, looking into week 3, my 3 main takeaways I think I want to keep track of in Dynasty. One comes from week 1. Durham Smythe in Miami as a tight end is gaining an awful lot of routes based on that overall route balance or the overall number of team on-field opportunities for receivers. He's got like 20% of the overall routes since week 1. Now, so far, it hasn't shown up in fantasy a lot, but he's got something of a red zone presence, and if that opportunity keeps up, despite how heavy hitting that wide receiver room is, I think he's going to show up for us a lot more in Dynasty. He's a very young, very interesting tight end, and in Dynasty, I always try and pay attention to those. He was still on the waiver wire in a couple of my leagues after waivers ran after week 1, and while he might be picked up in most leagues by now, I still someone I'm trying to add to trades because he hasn't really shown up in fantasy in week 1 or week 2, and so there still might be a window where we're still waiting a couple weeks before in-season stats, specifically points per game, actually starts beating preseason projections and rankings for this season. And so we've still got a couple more weeks where the uncertainty of how the offense is going to settle down leads to this small window of opportunity where you can try and take advantage of some things that people might be underreacting to, or they might be reacting too strongly to and not understanding the underlying signal. And I think Durham Smythe is interesting in that regard. Now, some other things that I think are interesting heading into week 3 is that rookies continue to be the biggest volume movers, especially we're in this window where stats in season aren't going to outcompete preseason expectations. So young players, especially rookies, are the only consistent group to increase in volume and increase in points per game consistently throughout a season. Most actually drop throughout the course of a season, but very young players or rookies are the one group of players that consistently increase in those areas that we want players to increase more consistently as the season progresses. So Quentin Johnson has so far done nothing, but he, Michael Mayer, and I also think Rashee Rice fits in this category despite his week 1 strong fantasy performance, because his overall route percentage has dropped significantly from week 1 to week 2. But he's also one of the few players adding more to the team on an expected points added basis in terms of a real opportunity or helping the team move the ball down the field, increasing their chances of winning the game than most players on that offense, especially without Travis Kelce, or when Travis Kelce isn't around in week 1. And I think the team might be looking for more sparks, should we call it? And Rashee Rice is one of the few players on that roster who's actually seemed to show that on an expected points added basis. So over these next few weeks, we might see his route percentage increase in the same way that Michael Mayer and Quentin Johnson, who have so far done nothing, could also be in that group of rookies who increase in opportunity as the season progresses. Where the first 2 weeks have been somewhat disappointing for Quentin Johnson and Michael Mayer, and we've had one good week for Rashee Rice, I think in Dynasty their values definitely haven't gone up. And again, paying attention to the underlying signal, we should probably expect, if they're going to be good, that to increase from here till the end of the season. And so where there's this small window of variability between in-season stats and preseason stats, if you like those players, I think now's a really good opportunity to start adding them to trades or seeing if your league mate is overreacting, perhaps correctly, but perhaps incorrectly, to the early 2-week signal. Now, I'm also paying attention to Josh Downs. This is something I mentioned in week 1, and I'm mentioning in week 2, and I mentioned this week in week 3 in both my DLF, Patreon articles, and on the Dynasty Crossroads. Alec Pierce and Jahan Dotson both ran a significant number of routes, especially based on their immediately after the 22 season ADP in Dynasty. And we highlighted them way back when. Now that's working out for Jahan Dotson, but Alec Pierce is still running a significant percentage of the team's overall underlying routes, meaning that his target share should come up, theoretically. But this is something that plagued him in his rookie season as well. A team's giving him opportunity with his decent draft capital and decent college profile. But this year, Josh Downs, through 2 weeks as a rookie, has a significantly higher target share on significantly less number of the team's underlying route percentage. In other words, he's adding more and less opportunities to the point that he's earning targets to have like 3 times the target share. Now, if these weren't rookies or young players, or we didn't have that signal for Alec Pierce rookie season, I might expect that to balance back, and that's what I would do in another team. But because they're rookies, and because this is something we saw from Alec Pierce in year 1, I think over the next few weeks, Josh Downs will start out routing as well as out targeting Alec Pierce, and that could lead to some significant value changes and also some significant weeks for Josh Downs in fantasy over the next couple of weeks. So again, a player to add to trades or keep on your bench or your taxi squad, even in redraft, I think he stands out pretty well as well. So those are some of the highlights that I took away from week 1 and week 2, and I'm putting in this week's column and this week's Patreon article, and I mentioned on the Dynasty Grind podcast. But there are a few other things that I want to mention for YouTube specifically while looking at running backs on my overall notes from teams' usages, trains, and regressions. And I thought we might take a look at that, like, now. I'm playing a lot with conditional formatting in the old database pinned to my Patreon timeline, so, check it out. And one of the things that I notice is that, everyone's been ready and willing to hate on Najee Harris for a while. Now, Najee Harris, believe it or not, actually has higher points per game than Jaylen Warren. Now, while Jaylen Warren is stealing a lot of those targets to the point that he's getting a 16% target share, which is 6.8% higher than we'd expect on a running back with his overall snap count, Najee Harris is still dominant in the rushing game. Now, I am concerned about Najee Harris because I'm concerned about Pittsburgh in general. This has been bad. Kenny Pickett is not doing well for the team. In fact, if you scroll down to the wide receivers over here on that pin database, you'll notice that all of them are underperforming on a points per touch basis. And the source of it is pretty clear when you look at the expected points added per opportunity for the overall team. Kenny Pickett is hurting them. And I don't even want to talk about, how disappointed I am with Pat Freiermuth. But I'm not disappointed with Pat Freiermuth, despite his inability to block without falling down, so much as I am with his offense, because Kenny Pickett isn't able to provide below average passing opportunity, and that's hurting the offense in general. And Deontay Johnson going on IR doesn't fill me with joy either. But Najee Harris is still getting 54% of the team's overall snaps on average on a week-by-week basis through 2 weeks. He's got 50% of the rushing expectation or rushing attempts on that team, which is actually high based on his overall snap count, because again, Jaylen Warren is getting involved. But something that I noticed overall that might still lead to some opportunities or some perhaps hidden value on Najee Harris despite this terrible situation is I don't think this team keeps passing in the red zone. So far it's got 10 opportunities inside the 20-yard line. You can't see that because my thing. Well, you have to scroll over to the table in the database, okay? It's passed 9 times inside the 20-yard line and it's rushed once. I don't think Kenny Pickett is the way to go in most areas of the field, and I don't think that keeps up inside the red zone. I think we're going to see more rushing opportunities when they get closer to the goal line. On the few times that Pittsburgh manages to get inside the 20-yard line, I think they start rushing a little bit more, especially as the season progresses. And so far, it's 9-1, so it's 90% of the time they're passing in the red zone. And I'm not an NFL coordinator, but I wouldn't give all of those opportunities. I wouldn't give 90% of those opportunities to Kenny Pickett. And so I think some of them are going to start to go to the rushing game. And where Najee Harris is the guy inside the red zone, or just in the rushing game in general, I think we see a higher percentage of those red zone attempts coming his way. So far, he's only got one, probably that one rushing carry. Jaylen Warren, however, despite them passing 9 times inside the red zone, isn't getting those targets inside the red zone. They're actually going to George Pickens and Jahan Dotson when he was on the field. So I think as time progresses, Najee Harris just, again, volume of opportunity and the fact the team should rush more times before the season ends inside the 20-yard line and inside the 10-yard line is going to lead to a few better games for Najee Harris, especially if they get something like an easy matchup. Although I don't know what an easy matchup looks like for Kenny Pickett. The other thing that we actually did note next week is that James Conner has infinite number of opportunities. Again, just playing a volume play in that offense. So far, he's only the running back 9 on the season. That seems a little high, but because of his overall opportunities, that should probably be consistent. Going back to my miss in week 2, James Cook finished inside the top 12 last week, but he still looks a little suspect to finish inside the top 12 for the season for me. His weighted opportunity is a top 24 running back, and that's, overall opportunities plus targets with a little boost on targets and then their overall red zone work so far. But Latavius Murray has a significant number of the opportunities inside the red zone. And while he's only on the field about 23% of the snaps on average through 2 weeks, he's actually underperforming in overall rushing opportunity, 10% less than you'd expect on that snap share, and target share. Now, Latavius Murray doesn't stand out to us in Dynasty in general, but based on his snap share and the fact that he's actually getting like 19% of the touches inside that 20-yard line, and in Buffalo, obviously they get to the red zone a fair amount, certainly more than Kenny Pickett. They've actually gotten inside the 20-yard line or had a rushing attempt or a target inside the 20-yard line 26 times. 42% of the time they're actually passing. So they actually like to rush in the red zone, which is why Latavius Murray looks pretty good. But again, as the season progresses and more touchdowns are scored, if anything like that balance continues, Latavius Murray might be one of those week 1 touchdown scorers more often than you'd expect, especially after week 2 and James Cook finishing inside the top 12. I don't think this backfield is fully written yet for fantasy. The last one I'll mention before we get out of here, if you're looking at running backs, I still think Dameon Pierce is interesting. And again, as we said coming into the season, he's in a top 12 breakout year, but he doesn't seem anything particularly special, despite the rookie volume earned last year. But he's still overall dominant in the overall opportunities. He's on the field for 45% of the snaps on average. He's getting 50% of the rushing opportunities, to the point that he's actually beating what you should expect on 45% of the snaps. Because actually sharing a lot of that work out to Michael Boone and Devin Singletary. And he's underperforming in target share. His target share should be about 1.4% higher based on a running back getting that level of opportunity. But again, that just seems kind of like Dameon Pierce. I don't think we should expect him to become a full 3-down running back. But while the team isn't special this year, I think CJ Stroud is doing a lot to prove himself fairly good in a difficult situation in 2023. And Dameon Pierce still has 50% of the overall red zone opportunity this season inside, again, the 20-yard line. And he's somewhat underperformed, because that's what Dameon Pierce does. He underperforms in his opportunity. But I don't think he's going to suddenly lose that opportunity outside of an injury. And as the season goes on, the team continues to improve with CJ Stroud. I think Dameon Pierce can pick up more touchdowns on that dominant overall opportunity inside the 20-yard line and inside the rushing game specifically. Now, while his 7% target share doesn't make him a dynasty darling because we chase the targets, I think right now, especially after the first 2 weeks, Dameon Pierce and Najee Harris and maybe Latavius Murray offer some really interesting depth to add to your running back position for a team that's struggling through the first 2 weeks and might be looking more towards the future than they are towards the end of this season. So if your team is in the opposite situation, I think that's interesting. And I know that I said that was going to be the last note this week, but while I'm in Houston, I feel bad because I noticed after week 1 that Nico Collins' usage was pretty good, and I started in one of my fantasy leagues, which is good. But I still think his overall opportunity looks a little bit overbalanced. The routes are still remarkably split. He's getting 16% Tank Dell, or Nathaniel Dell is getting 14% of the underlying routes, and Robert Woods is getting 18%. Now that's on a per game basis through 2 weeks, so all the little asterisks and caveats belong here. But a typical wide receiver 1 averages about 21% of the team's overall underlying routes. While that might change based on their overall ADOT and how often those types of routes get ran, I looked at the average relative to that, and I still think Nico Collins is outkicking his coverage. Again, here we play the game of if you believe in the player, you think his routes are going to come up. But I don't think there's been a real reason, especially since he's so far into his career, to expect a higher route share week 4, 5, 6, and 7 than we've seen week 1 or week 2. But he has been performing really well with 0.9% or 0.9 expected points added per opportunity, which is really good for a wide receiver. But I think he might be being slightly efficient on a poor foundation of route percentage for the team's overall opportunities. Nathaniel Dell increased significantly in week 2, and again, there's some injuries playing a role in that too. But he's a rookie gaining ground, and Nico Collins is not a veteran, but a player further into his career who's kind of outkicking his coverage in terms of overall field opportunities, and especially where we've got a rookie QB leading the team. I think that should make us more suspect of what the overall offensive balance is going to look like by week 6, where we're standing right now heading into week 3. So I think Tank Dell looks like a player rising in opportunity. I think Nico Collins looks like a guy scoring more points than he should, even though he's having a really strong start to his season and is definitely kicking me for a few takes I've had in his career earlier. But I don't think this is going to settle down into an all-out win in Dynasty, and so he's kind of on my sell window. Actually, Houston's really interesting for opportunities. I've mentioned Dalton Schultz both weeks in that article as well. He's someone that looked like his target share should rise after week 1, and he continues to look like that after week 2. Again, he's 12% under expected in target share because he's running 18% of the team routes, which is also why this offensive balance over at the wide receiver position is so evenly split. It's because they've got a tight end earning heavy routes. And Schultz should start scoring more points per touch and more fantasy startable weeks based on that underlying volume or in terms of on-field opportunities. So Houston's a really interesting place to look right now if you're looking for dynasty windows or even in-season windows. Fitting stuff in-season content has been tricky, but I think I've found a balance, and I'm going to start making weekly videos looking at these trends, and some that I might not have been able to mention because the data hadn't updated for my Patreon article or my DLF article or the Crossroads. So, check them out. Please do. Let me know what you think of them. And you can check out this table and all my data. Obviously, it's pinned to my timeline as it is every year in season. I post the weekly data, every weekly stat that I collect for every player. And then I'm condensing it into a basic tab so you can just see the overall percentages or overall numbers. And then I make this too long didn't read report table that you see right here on the video in a separate tab, and you can flick through the teams and see essentially this for every team as a stats update. So check those out if you're interested in. You can find them all through my link tree, which is somewhere in the description, I'm sure, or just check out my Twitter timeline at Pahowdy, and or comment below if you can't find anything out, and I will send you a link. Sorry for missing the first 2 weeks on YouTube, but I will see you again next week for week 4, and hopefully get better at doing this in one shot so the editing gets less worse.